Hi, my name's Annalisa, and if you don't know me, I am a blogger on Lady of Leisure, a new website that I started where I talk about lifestyle and my personal life and predominantly astrology. I do horoscopes. I have had multiple requests from people to do a video on how to see compatibility using your birth chart. So whether that's for dating, marriage, um, even seeing kind of friendship dynamics, business partnerships, that kind of stuff. I tend to attract a lot of people that want relationship advice in readings, tarot, and astrology. And it's not something that I purposefully have called in or catered myself to, but it's just something that comes to me. And I tend to, I don't know, just end up being somebody that people ask that advice from regularly. So I figured, hey, I've been married for 10 years. I've been with my partner going on 14 years. And while I'm in a very monogamous, straight, cisgendered relationship, I'm a very open-minded, progressive person and tend to be pretty good at coaching people in their relationships for some reason. I don't know. I also feel like I tend to do pretty well seeing compatibility in the birth chart. Also, something I don't know why, that's just an area of life, I guess, I have figured out in some way or another that I don't feel like I have figured out, but according to some other people, it seems like I do. So I am going to share the way that I look at compatibility in the birth chart, which are things that I learned from teachers of mine and books that I've read. One of the books that came out recently that I've recommended to some friends, especially if you're not an astrologer, that can be really fun is Jessica Lanyadoo. She came out with a book a few years ago called Astrology for Real Relationships. I'll put the link in the description here, and that can be a really fun way to kind of get into some of this stuff. In astrology, compatibility is called synastry. And synastry is when we're looking at one birth chart and another birth chart, and we're comparing the two to see if this looks like a compatible match. Another type of compatibility reading that you can do is called a composite chart, where essentially the two people's birth dates are mathematically calculated in a way where it creates a birth chart for your relationship. So it's kind of like your guys's melding and what that would look like. I personally do not look at composite charts very often or very frequently. I tend to be more focused on synastry. And so that's what this video is going to be about. Just synastry. Composite charts are great. I look at them too sometimes, but it hasn't been the dominant way that I've done compatibility readings. That might change someday, but I'm just letting people know that this is synastry, not composite. So before we get started, there's just a few things that I want to share. I got permission from my husband to use his natal chart for this video, and I'm using my own natal chart because I'm going to show how we are compatible and then the ways that we're not 100% compatible. I'm also just winging this right now. I haven't written anything out. I tend to be somebody where like once I get the spark of inspiration, I just wing it, and then I'm not really speaking super eloquently. I also no makeup, just in my pajamas, decided to do this because I've been thinking about it for a few days. I'm also trying to be more confident in showing up as my no makeup self just as much as my makeup self in videos, because I'm realizing that there's a lot of pressure when you're doing videos to look presentable. And while I want to look presentable, I also don't know if I can do a full face of makeup every single time I want to do a video. So I would prefer to just get used to seeing my natural self with my hair just kind of whatever on top of my glam self where I look good too. I think both are great, right? We have both sides. I literally have no makeup on, but I do have the little zoom filter on that makes you look a little bit better. So I do look a little worse than this. I'm not gonna lie. Also, with that said, I'm winging it, but also it's important to know that when we're looking at people's birth charts and we're sharing them with other people, most astrologers, I don't want to say all astrologers because I don't know if all astrologers follow these rules, but it's said a good code of conduct when you're an astrologer. There's certain ethical codes of conduct that we are kind of set to follow if we want to kind of play by the rules. And one of them is that we don't look at somebody's birth chart without their permission, or we don't share somebody's birth chart with an astrologer or somebody else without their permission. And so it's important to know that I asked for permission from my husband. He said yes for this video, which was shocking to me because he's a very private person. But I'm excited because I think our birth charts are two really good examples of compatible synastry. And then we are going to look at a couple celebrity charts, and one person in the celebrity chart is deceased. And so while we're not really able to ask for permission, literally from the people that I'm going to look at, it is public information and public knowledge with lots of articles writing about them. And so from a respectful standpoint, we're just going to talk about what's already happened. These people are already not together. And we'll just talk about some of the things in those birth charts that clash that might have been why the relationship had a harder time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get these birth charts up here. So this chart on the left is my husband's birth chart. And this chart on the right is my birth chart. And so when I'm looking at compatibility for people, there's a few things that we can look at. So the first few things that we can look at that are really basic in general, that I think today in modern astrology, a lot of our culture, like our pop culture with astrology, pop astrology, we're always talking about our sun, moon, and rising sign. And while sun, moon, and rising are really great to look for compatibility, they're not always it. So like you could have sun sign compatibility, meaning your sun is compatible with somebody else's sun, but it doesn't mean that you guys are actually going to be compatible in a partnership. Excuse me. We're having a big windstorm here right now. So if you hear a whistling in the background, it's from the wind, and then it's kind of kicking up stuff and I'm getting allergies. So I probably should have waited to do this video, but I'm just going to try to do it. Okay. So I'm also making sure there's a couple things here I want to make sure. Yeah, okay. So sun sign compatibility is not everything, obviously. I mean, to me, that's obvious, but if you're new to astrology, that might not be obvious. So you could say, oh, this guy has the sun sign that I like, and it could be a total shit show, you know, like if you're just basing compatibility off that, that's not accurate. Rising sign can also be something worth looking at, but again, like somebody having a compatible rising sign with you doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be compatible in a relationship or a business partnership or a friendship. Moon compatibility is actually, out of the three, one that we do look for a little bit more. I'm going to get into the ways that we look at compatibility with the moon, because it doesn't necessarily mean that your moon signs have to be compatible. It just means that the moon is something that we look at to see if there is synastry in the chart, meaning there's other things in the chart that are compatible with that moon sign, because the moon is what we emotionally need. And so a lot of times in a relationship, we are looking for somebody to fulfill our emotional needs. And so the moon placement is really a good indicator of seeing how somebody operates in that way and how they're able to meet us emotionally. I think that there's a lot of people that we connect with, like if we think about our sun and our rising sign, it's more who we are in our identity, how we are out in the world. And, you know, the rising sign sometimes is said to be more of like the mask that we wear out in the world. And the moon is underneath all of that. The moon is under the surface. And so the moon is a little bit more private. It's not really what we show people inherently. Some people do, but it's not like the first thing compared to the sun and the rising. And so it's important to see somebody's moon sign, because that's really who they are underneath and what they need emotionally. And so you could have somebody that you're so compatible with out in the world, but then once it comes to meeting those emotional needs, you're not, right? So that's something that we look for. The other thing that we're looking for with compatibility charts is the Venus placement. So Venus is the planet of love and romance and beauty. And Venus is also kind of where we experience pleasure. And so wherever Venus is can tell us how this person's love language is, essentially, like what they like to do when they're feeling romantic, how they want to be romanced, as well as how they might romance. And that placement is really important, because if people's Venus placements are incompatible, they speak different love languages. And so some people might, have a love language that is acts of service, and some people might have a love language that is more sexual, and while both people might enjoy those things, the way that it affects them on a deeper level is different. So, there's some people where acts of service, that to them means you love them. If your daily routine and you're cleaning and you're, aware of those things, that to them is everything, more than sex. And then there's people where they don't pay attention to any of that stuff. Daily routine, acts of service, like it's not a priority for them, but the sex is a really big priority. And so those are things that we can see with Moon and Venus placements, but Moon is more emotional needs. Venus is more of our love language. The third thing that we look for in a compatibility chart is and this is not every astrologer, so it just depends on whether or not the astrologer is working with this asteroid, but Juno is a big, so this is Juno right here in my chart. That's Venus next to Juno, and here's my moon. So memorizing these glyphs obviously is something that takes some time, but Juno is the asteroid that rules marriage. And so Juno is kind of like, it's similar to Venus in the sense that it's things that we need in a partnership, but it's more contractual. It's not necessarily romantic. It has more to do with kind of our deal breakers. So if these things aren't getting met with our Juno placement, it's a big problem for us. So those three things are very, very, very important when looking at compatibility in a birth chart. Of course, the sun and the rising signs can aid in that. I don't want to say that they're not worth finding compatibility with, but if those Moon, Venus, and Juno placements aren't there, the relationship's going to have a much harder time. The fourth thing that we look at in compatibility are the houses, the 7th and the 8th house, and what sign is ruling the descendant. So the descendant is the opposite of our rising sign, and the descendant rules the 7th house, which is the house that rules relationships, specifically partnerships. So that could be best friends, business partnerships, and romantic relationships. We usually put an emphasis on romantic relationships in this house, but it's also just general partnership. The 8th house is the house that rules sex and marriage and shared resources and assets. And so whatever we have in our 8th house, or whatever sign placement in our 8th house, says a lot about how we operate in that way. And so for me, when I'm doing synastry and compatibility charts, this is everything that I look at in somebody's birth chart to be able to really tell not just whether or not they're compatible with that other person, but also being able to tell what this person actually needs in a relationship in order to feel okay. And so I think what we tend to fail to do when we're looking at compatibility readings, if we're not astrologers, like if you're just kind of Joe Schmo that's excited about astrology and wants to see if you're compatible with somebody, is that you haven't really taken the time to learn who you are and what you need. And that's important, because identifying your Venus, Juno, Moon placements and the houses they're in, plus your 7th and 8th house signatures, that's going to tell you what you need in a relationship in order to feel okay. Then when you go in to pull somebody else's chart and look, you can see, once you've kind of learned how to look at this, whether or not that person's able to meet your needs and whether or not you're able to meet theirs, because it might be really apparent that there's some things that you disagree on. So let's get into doing that. So what makes things compatible? So there's a few different, I'm like, this is so simple. And then once I get into it, I'm like, this is actually kind of complex. So in astrology, we have 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. And so we have 3 fire signs, 3 air signs, 3 earth signs, 3 water signs. Elements like each other. The same element likes each other. So fire likes fire, water likes water, air likes air, earth likes earth. So the signs that are of the same element tend to be very compatible for each other. So Aries likes Leo, Leo likes Sagittarius. Sagittarius likes Aries. Taurus likes Capricorn. Capricorn likes Virgo. Virgo likes Taurus, and so on and so on. So that's one way that we look at compatibility. So if somebody's Venus is in an air sign and somebody else's Venus is in an air sign, that makes what's called a trine. And trine is easy flowing energy in the birth chart. This blue line, which is a 120-degree angle, is a trine, and that's considered to be easy. The 60-degree angle in the chart is called a sextile. And sextiles are when a sign is 1/, but is within the same polarity. So we also have the yin and the yang polarity. So fire and air is yang, and earth and water is yin. And so when we have a sextile, that angle, that 60 degrees, is hopping over one sign to the next sign, and they're in the same polarity. They're both yin. So yin signs tend to like other yin signs, and yang signs tend to like other yang signs. So fire and air are yang, they like each other. Earth and water, yin, they like each other. And so sextiles are considered harmonious energies for that reason, because you're essentially speaking the same language, right? If you're the same element as somebody, even if it's expressed in a different way, you're still on the same frequency, right? So it's still that fire energy. You're still speaking the same language. And then if, yang is considered to be very outward expressed or extroverted energy. So fire and air being yang, they both express themselves more extrovertedly. And so they're speaking the same language. Yin are more reserved and more introverted and internal, and so they tend to be speaking the same language. That's a very general overview of that, because what also dictates how that's expressed is where it sits in the birth chart, what houses they're in. So you could have a yang person that's very fiery, but if they have a lot of energy in the bottom half of this chart, they are more introverted. Also, if their moon placement is in a yin sign, they have that polarity. They're yang and yin, right? So we're going to talk about that looking at my birth chart and my husband's birth chart. So a few things already. So we're just going to talk about our big three, and you're already going to see some similarities between us. I am a Leo sun in the 8th house. My husband is an Aries sun in the 9th house. We both have our suns in the interpersonal quadrant of the chart. That transpersonal quadrant. This is the interpersonal quadrant. The transpersonal quadrant has a lot to do with how you're connecting with the world in a kind of more externalized way. And so we both have this emphasis in our chart in that quadrant, and our suns are both in fire signs. So our suns already have some compatibility. They're different signs, but they're both in the fire element. They're both in the same quadrant of the chart. Rising, I'm Sagittarius rising at 17 degrees. You can't really see that there. And my husband is Leo rising at 28 degrees. And so there's a few things that I'm going to talk about here that might be a bit advanced for new people with astrology, but I'm just going to do it anyways. My sun is at 25 degrees and his rising is at 28 degrees of Leo. So these are both in the sign of Leo. His rising sign is essentially conjunct my sun. So that's really positive because he's speaking my language when it comes to Leo, especially because the rising sign is also a sun-like energy. It's considered to be our second sun sign, some say. And so that's already super compatible for us just from the solar placement in that way. His sun at 19 degrees Aries is making a trine, so that easy flowing of energy, to my Sagittarius rising. So my rising sign is making a harmonious aspect to his sun. His sun is also making a harmonious aspect to my sun. It's trining his rising as well as trining my sun. So already, just with our sun and rising placements, which I said are not necessarily the indicators that we look at for a healthy, compatible relationship, but we're already speaking the same language when it comes to how we outwardly express ourselves. And sometimes the way you outwardly express yourself also has to do with some of the things that you enjoy doing, your sense of humor, the things that you kind of are attracted to in life. And so him and I already are sharing a lot of those similarities. So let's get into the lunar placement. So I was born the day after a full moon. So if I was born on the full moon, I would have been an Aquarius moon. But because I was born the day after, I am a Pisces moon. However, I still fall within the degrees that make me a full moon child. I also was born the day after a lunar eclipse. So that's why there's my south node on the sun. So that adds a certain energy to me, having that lunar eclipse, full moon energy. But I have a water moon, Pisces moon. And my Pisces moon is in the third house, which is the house of communication. And people that have their moon placement in the third house have to talk about their feelings. They're emotional process talkers. So talking things out for me is really important. And if it bugs people, they're screwed, because that's just, I can't not do that. Like, that's just how I work through stuff. And I can have friendships that are superficial where we don't do that. But if you're going to be my partner or deep in my life, like, we have to be able to talk about things. And because it's Pisces, a lot of crying is going to happen. I'm a super emotional person. I'm also very, very empathic, very sensitive. Pisces moons are said to be like a sponge where we just absorb a lot of the feelings in the air. So I'm really sensitive to the energy of other people. And so that's just something that's really important about who I am, because whoever comes into my life who's close with me is going to either love that about me or hate it about me, right? Because those are my emotional needs. Like, that's something that's just kind of inherent to who I am. So let's look at my husband's moon. We already see that his moon placement is in his third house as well. And so already, like, let's not even talk about the sign, but just him having a third house moon means that he also needs to emotionally process talk. And so that's really positive for both of us, even with it not being in the same sign, because we both know with a third house moon, we're both going to be needing to talk about our feelings a lot. And that's really constructive for me, having a partner that's also like that, right? So that's a compatible signature for us. The other thing about him is that his moon is in Scorpio. And so what did I say earlier about elements liking each other? Water likes water, fire likes fire. So he has a water moon and I have a water moon. And while they're not necessarily in full aspect to each other, because they're pretty wide degree wise, so his moon's at 7 degrees, my moon's at 20 degrees. So that's pretty wide orb. They don't actually really make a trine. The signs still make a trine, and it's still the same element. And so water is a very emotional element. It rules emotions, it rules our intuition, it rules kind of more of the subconscious, the psychic realms. And so people that have water moons, especially in the third house, tend to be highly intuitive and very sensitive to other people's feelings. And it's said to be kind of a more psychic placement too. And so my husband and I are both experiencing water moons in the third house. So already, even though they're different, Pisces and Scorpio are two completely different signs. They're very compatible together in the sense that they're both the water element, and then having them in that same house, super compatible. So that's the lunar placement. Let's get into the Venus placement. So my Venus is at 1 degree Libra in my 9th house. So Libra is a sign where fairness and harmony and balance in a relationship are really, really important. Another thing that people don't really talk about with Libra is Libra, I mean, we do talk about it with Libra, but I think we don't necessarily think about it in terms of a love language always. Is Libra is the sign that rules karma and justice. And so Saturn is exalted in Libra because that's kind of considered to be karmic justice. So that's the cause and effect of our actions, but not just in the way that we experience justice in the human construct, but the natural order of things, the natural laws that we have to abide by in the universe, you know, just like people are born and they die, like that just happens. Like death is just a natural part of life. And so people with Venus in Libra tend to value people that take accountability or take responsibility for their side of things, because that's considered to be fair. That's considered to be balanced. Libra also really likes beauty and things that are kind of aesthetically pleasing. And so for me, having a midheaven in Venus in Libra, I really like things to look a certain way and feel a certain way. And I also really like there to be kind of some fairness or balance around that in my home when I'm expressing that with other people. I also like to be around people that have similar aesthetics as me when I'm in a relationship. And I've noticed that when I've had relationships where I was with people where we didn't like the same taste or the same style, it really didn't mesh well. Even though I'm wired to be very go with the flow and mutable, it was a point of contention to not have similar taste. And so that's also something that Libra can kind of have to do with. But another part of it is the fairness, the equality, kind of the need for things to be balanced in the relationship. I don't do well in partnerships where I feel like the workload of the home isn't balanced. So looking at my husband's chart, he has quite a few placements in Libra, but he doesn't really have any of his Venus or Juno placements there. So there is a little bit of tension with that. So he has Pluto, Saturn, Pallas Athena, and Mars in Libra, which does help my Libra placements in the sense that he has energy in Libra, so he understands that, but it's expressed differently. And so we don't always see eye to eye on how we communicate about those things. However, because we both have Libra placements, we get it. So a lot of times, even though it might take some arguing or some kind of refiguring out of things, we always come to an agreement about it because we both value that from a Libra standpoint, even though it's expressed differently. But that's something kind of, interesting. The other thing about my Libra placement is that it's in the 9th house, and him having his sun in the 9th house means that we value similar things when it comes to 9th house themes. And the 9th house has a lot to do with higher education and learning, and also philosophy, metaphysical practices, esoteric kind of practices, art. Art's kind of more of a 12th house and 5th house theme, but I think the 9th house is where we want to experience other cultures and the things that they create. And I think that people that have a lot of 9th house placements tend to value a lot of art from other cultures, things like that. And my husband and I are both very much into that kind of stuff. And I think my Venus being in the 9th house and his sun being in the 9th house is another kind of little nod to some of the compatibility without it necessarily being direct compatibility. It's just kind of another way that we speak a similar language. Let's see here. We're going to look at his Venus now. So his Venus is in Pisces in the 7th house. So one of the things that's really beneficial about him having Pisces in the 7th house for me is that my moon is in his well, I think technically it's closer to his 8th house, but it's, the same energy as his 7th and beginning of his 8th house. And again, that 8th house is the marriage house. And so him having his relationship energy be Pisces is really positive for my lunar placement. It's a very compatible energy because his love language in that way has Piscean traits. Him having Venus in Pisces, his Venus is at 3 degrees Pisces. So it's not right. My moon and his Venus are not conjunct, but they're speaking the same language. And so his Venus energy complements my moon energy very well because they're in the same sign. And especially for the location that it's in his chart, because that's the relationship energy. So his love language is very Piscean. He's very intuitive to me. He always knows when I'm not doing okay. He always knows what I want and what I need. He's very good at meeting my needs in that intuitive way. He's very sensitive and empathic to me. Trying to think what else. There's an artistic quality to Pisces that we both share quite a bit. We're both musicians. We both, like I said, we love aesthetics and things like that. And so, yeah, we have a really similar way of nurturing each other and kind of love language for that reason. So let's get to Juno. Juno is the asteroid that represents marriage. And like I said, contractual marriage. So the things that we value. My Juno, this is kind of fun to me. My Juno is at 27 degrees Virgo. So we see mine over here on the right side, really close to my Venus placement. And I'm one of those people where acts of service are important to me. Virgo is a sign where acts of service, daily routine, and health and organization, things like that are really important. And having it in the 9th house intellect, like being intellectual is important to me. Knowing things about things is something that I really value and I find attractive in people. My husband's Juno is in Capricorn in the fifth house. So the fifth house is traditionally ruled by Leo. And so all of the Leo themes of creative expression and the need for validation, the need to kind of give praise, you know, that kind of stuff is something that's really prominent for him, having Juno in the fifth house, which him being Leo rising, he's already like that. And me being a Leo, I'm also like that. So that's covered in our relationship. But having it in Capricorn is a very success oriented sign. It very much it's driven. It likes to be successful. It likes to be a leader. It kind of likes to be the boss. And so for him, being able to be a partner that provides and is successful and has kind of this sense of leadership and, you know, I'm trying to not use the word dominance, but I know that Capricorn does really like to be dominant. And so does Aries. Aries and Capricorn tend to need to control things, and they do like to be pretty dominant in a relationship. And, you know, Leo is one of those signs where we kind of feel like nobody can dominate us. And Sagittarius, my Sag rising, needs a lot of freedom. And so I think that sometimes my husband can be that way, but I'm a very go with the flow person, and I'm a very romantic person. And I do actually really like his possessive energy towards me. It's not something that bothers me. I actually really enjoy it. But for somebody else, it could be too much. It could feel like he's too controlling or too dominant in certain ways, having those placements. But I'm very mutable. I'm very go with the flow. I like having a partner in marriage that especially a man that like takes more of that role. Like it's very sexy to me. And I have dated men that were a little less like that, and it just felt like it wasn't together. My Virgo Juno felt like it was very unkept, and I didn't like that because my Virgo Juno wants somebody that's put together and wants somebody that values the same things that I do. And so even though throughout our relationship, I would say that I've had to work on that. Like I've had to teach my husband how to do that with me. He values it because I think his Capricorn energy and his Juno wants to succeed, wants to be successful, the thing about Capricorn too, I will say, if you have Venus or Juno in Capricorn, you want a traditional courtship. And so you want kind of whatever the society at the time considers traditional. And so for him, you know, he likes the traditional kind of cisgendered man stuff, but he's also a very progressive person, which doesn't impede my feminism or my need to kind of be my own person. And so, you know, that could be a number of things in our charts that I'm not going to get too into. I'm just kind of talking about ways that we look at compatibility. But it's a harmonious thing, the house that it's in and the fact that it's in an earth sign. So again, like the elements like each other. And so having his Capricorn Juno and my Virgo Juno, those are two earth signs. Both of our Junos are in earth signs. And so that's a very compatible energy for both of us, to have like what we need contractually to be in an earth element, and to have us kind of, even if it's different, it meets kind of in the middle in a similar way. And so let's talk about some areas where there's a little bit of conflict for us, and kind of finding ways to identify conflict in a birth chart. So one of the really obvious things for me with some of our history at this point and some of our conflict is the fact that modality speaking, we can kind of see where there's differences in a chart. So the modalities in astrology are cardinal signs, fixed signs, and mutable signs. And this particular website, astro.com, which allows you to calculate free birth charts, I really still, after all these years, really enjoy this website, even though I know I should probably have advanced to a better software. I do have iEphemeris, but I want to buy a new computer before I buy a really expensive software, because this computer's on its way out. But anyways, getting back on topic, the cardinal fixed mutable will kind of tell us a lot about compatibility. So cardinal signs initiate things, and a lot of cardinal energy is very controlling, as well as fixed energy. Fixed energy is known to be kind of stubborn because it likes to stabilize things and keep them there. It's meant to stabilize and, you know, be immovable and just the workhorses. The fixed signs are the workhorses. The cardinal signs kind of charge ahead and start things. And then the mutable signs take all of the things that the cardinal and fixed people are doing and expand upon them. They see the bigger picture, or they want to expand upon whatever the idea is and make it adhere to more things. Mutable signs are also really good at seeing the long-term trajectory of something. And so they tend to be good problem solvers because they see all of the possible outcomes or different scenarios. The thing about mutable signs that can be kind of hard is that they are so scattered and thinking about so many things that getting them to hone in on one thing or stabilize and just work on something can be really difficult. So there's certain aspects to the modalities that can aid in compatibility or can make certain things about compatibility harder. So my husband is a cardinal fire sun sign, Aries. Then he's got fixed Leo as his rising, and then he's got fixed Scorpio as his moon. So what I know about this, like I already know it about him, but just if I see somebody like this, Aries itself is a very independent sign, very confident, very charge ahead, and it's fire energy that's cardinal. So sometimes it acts before thinking. He has Mercury, the planet that rules the mind, conjunct his sun. So he actually thinks a lot because Mercury is in a placement that shows that, but the sun is kind of dominant in that. So he's still not thinking as much as a mutable Mercury or mutable person might. So that already like kind of impulsive, impatient energy is there. And we can kind of see that with the Mercury placement too. Whereas when we look at my chart, my sun sign is in fixed Leo. And so one of the things that's hard about Leos is because we're fixed, we tend to get very fixed in our ideas or the things that we like. And we tend to be very immovable and kind of arrogant. And Aries can also be kind of arrogant with that. And so the nice thing is Leo and Aries, you know, like each other for that reason, because they're the same in that way, in a lot of ways. But there can also be some clashing because if they don't like the same things, getting one person to change their minds is really difficult. So you need to find people that are into the same things as you when you're these signs, because you're not gonna bend too much to the will of others. Mars is the ruler of Aries. Mars rules the will and it charges ahead. It doesn't bend to the will of others. My Mercury placement, however, is in the mutable sign of Virgo, which is way more adaptable and way more willing to see somebody else's perspective and all the other sides to things. If I had Mercury in Leo, I don't know if our relationship would be as good as it is, because that would add another layer to my own stubbornness when it comes to my point of view. But having a Mercury in Virgo makes me a lot more open to seeing all the sides to a situation because it's an immutable sign. So that's also something that can be a really good indication of how somebody is in themselves and how that relates in a compatible or incompatible way. The rising, so he's fixed Leo. So again, talking about my fixed Leo and his fixed Leo, while it's compatible, it can still also be kind of hard if we both have different ideas about how something should go and we're not agreeing on something. However, I'm Sag rising. Sagittarius is the mutable fire sign. And so Sagittarius is, again, that mutable energy, a lot more open to all the possibilities and actually very interested in exploring them. Sagittarius always wants to know. It's called the seeker for a reason. It's ruled by Jupiter. It rules the 9th house, which is that house that him and I have a lot of energy in. And so for me, when, you know, I have the Aries Leo coming at me, maybe in a way that's aggressive or assertive or not agreeing with me, my Mercury Virgo and Sag rising is like, okay, cool. Let's explore it. Let's talk about it. Let's explore it. because his sun is in the ninth house, even though he's got that hard Aries energy, he also wants to explore it because he's got a ninth house sun. So that's actually really helpful for both of us. It makes us work it out really well. We're one of those couples where we've been able to work out we've been through so much shit and we've just been able to work out so much. And I do think it's because our desire to explore outcomes and try different things, we're just very open in that way. And despite him having so much fixed energy and me having, some fixed energy, I'm always willing to bend first because I'm mutable. And then he has some of these placements where he likes that. Like his Venus in Pisces is very mutable. So he does bend at some point. Talking about the lunar placement. So Scorpio moon and Pisces moon are totally different. They operate very differently, but one thing that they both need is alone time and privacy to recharge. And so those are things that him and I value quite a lot, having water moons. We also need to talk about our feelings. We need to vent. And so if people can't handle that around us, it doesn't work out very well for us because it's just a way that we process. And so we did go to marriage counseling together and it was great. We loved marriage counseling. And of course we did, right? Because we're wired to be romantics and we're wired to want to talk about it and talk about our feelings. The only difference is that, his having this fixed Scorpio energy and me having mutable Pisces, we express it differently. And so for him, when he wants privacy or alone time, it's very private, very quiet, very shut off, and very reserved, which is more of a fixed trait. And for me, I'm not so much like that. I'm a little bit more whimsical and a little bit more cuddly and gushy, but he has that side too, having the Venus in Pisces. So it complements. But being Aries, Scorpio, these are both signs that need a lot of alone time and privacy. And so that is something that somebody like me, who's wired to be less like that, has had to learn to be comfortable around and not take it personally, because I'm a little bit more codependent. I would say I'm wired to be a little bit more codependent than he is, even though we share some similar codependency signatures. Before I get into looking more at incompatibility, I'm trying to see if there's anything else with this. Oh, one thing I wanted to note too that I forgot, I talked about myself where I was born the day after a full moon in having this water moon. I wanted to make note that he also is that. He's born the day after a full moon. So he, if he was born one day earlier, or even like however many hours earlier, he would have been a Libra moon. But because he was born a little bit later, he's still a full moon baby, but has a water moon. And so we're both full moon babies with water moons and fire suns and fire risings. So that's something that's really interesting about our charts, right? Is the fact that we share a lot of these similarities. I did not know my husband's birth chart when we got together. I did not do astrology to this extent. I was interested in astrology. I knew that we were compatible sun sign wise. I knew that Leo and Aries were both very compatible signs. I've always been interested in compatibility with sun signs. And I've tracked like all my best friends, all my boyfriends, everything my entire life. But I wasn't an astrologer. I didn't know how to do this from a chart perspective. And it wasn't until my husband and I had been together for 5 or 6 years before I got our birth charts. And when I started doing this, I was amazed. I was like, I can't believe that we have this much compatibility in our birth chart, because it made so much sense to me. Because when we met, it felt like a movie. I mean, not when we met, I should say, when we got together, it felt like a movie. And it felt very magical. And I just felt like we had this connection that I couldn't explain. And it felt like all the things you hear about where people say, like, this is my soulmate, this is karmic and all that stuff, which I still to this day kind of eye roll at sometimes. But once I saw our birth charts, I was like, oh, wow, no wonder why we felt that way together, because we are so compatible astrologically. One of the things I want to say about that before I get into looking at somebody else's chart is that I've had a lot of people come to me in astrology readings wanting to compare charts with somebody, or wanting to talk about people saying, I feel like this person is my soulmate. I want to share my perspective as an astrologer on the soulmate debacle, the soulmate question. And it's hard for me because I do have a husband and a situation. If you heard our whole relationship story, it's weird. It's weird, it's wild, it's crazy, it's cosmic, and it feels like everything that you say about karmic and soul relationships, like it's all of that. So as somebody that has that story and has that thing, I'm still saying this. And so I really want people in relationships to take this to heart when it comes to looking at charts. You're going to feel soul connections with people that you share a lot of astrological compatibility with. The people that you tend to gravitate towards, whether it's friendships, business partnerships, creative projects, or romantic partnerships, the people that you feel that magnetism, that magic with, I promise you, if you look at your charts together, you will see some signatures in there that make sense why you see it. Since I've been an astrologer, I look at all my best friends' charts and it's all there. It's all there, the magic, the connection, all of that. And I think that the thing that we're not looking at as a culture in astrology, maybe, and maybe some people are, but that I hear a lot with like twin flame stuff, is that we're not taking into account the fact that if you're wired similarly as somebody else, that you're going to feel that connection with. And it's not to diminish the connection, but there's a lot of people in the world that share astrological compatibility with each other. It's about learning how to identify that and feel it, but not getting hung up on the fact that you feel that magnetism, because fire likes fire, air likes air, water likes water, earth likes earth, yin likes yin, yang likes yang. And so when you are with somebody that's speaking your language from an astrological perspective, it's going to feel that way. It's going to feel like a soul connection. It's going to feel like a karmic connection. And from an astrological point of view, it is a soul connection and a karmic connection. Does it mean that they're your soul mate? Does it mean that they're the person that you're meant to be with, even when they're treating you like shit or they're abusive? No, not at all. Not at all. And so if you're feeling a karmic connection with somebody or a soul connection with somebody, and you look at a chart and you see all this compatibility, does it mean you're supposed to be with them or you're meant to be with them? No, not necessarily. There's other people in the world that are going to have signatures that you're compatible with. And so that's the part that's, I feel, really important to say, is that I don't believe that you just have one person out there forever. Do I feel like I have that in my life? Totally. It happened. I didn't think it was going to happen. I didn't even think that I was a monogamous straight person when I was younger. I thought I was going to end up being a vagabond, polyamorous, queer, and as I got older and started exploring sexually and dating, I realized that I did really like men and I did really like monogamy. And then I ended up with a man and we're monogamous and our charts are super compatible. And I have that story that's very like the twin flame bullshit. I mean, we have twin fire energy, but as an astrologer, do I believe that that has to be the case to have a successful relationship, or that if you have compatibility in your birth chart, you should put up with abuse and that's your one soulmate? I don't believe any of that stuff. And when I see a lot of these podcasts or psychics kind of talking about stuff in that way, who aren't astrologers and who don't do astrology compatibility charts, like synastry charts, it really bugs me. I hate it. I can't stand it. I don't watch any of that stuff. It drives me crazy. And that's coming from somebody that has like all of, like, my fairy tale was, my romance was like that, and I don't abide by that logic. I don't think it's healthy. I think a lot of people stay in really abusive, manipulative relationships because they think that they are with their soulmate, and they're not aware that we can feel these connections with people that we share very basic compatibility with. Does not necessarily mean that they're right for us, because we're going to feel that magnetism if we have those similar signatures. So that's my 2 cents there. This is turning into a really long video, but I really want to share a couple birth charts that I didn't get ready. Let's see if I have them on here still. I might have gotten rid of them. I'm just going to, I'm going to pause this and find them and hop back on. Okay, so the charts that I'm going to share now, we're going to actually look at Princess Diana and King Charles, because these are two charts that I actually looked at for the Sober Curator when we were talking about Princess Diana's life. We reviewed kind of one of the documentaries that came out about her, and I looked at the chart of her and King Charles and just saw kind of some things that were really apparent to me why they were together, but also why they weren't together. So kind of like following the same formula. We're going to start with Sun, Moon, Rising just to kind of see where it's at. So Princess Diana is a Cancer sun in the 7th house. So again, 7th house of relationships. Her descendant, so that angle that rules the 7th house, is in Gemini. Another thing too to make note is that her sun in the 7th is conjunct Mercury in Cancer. And so even though it's not necessarily in the 3rd house, Mercury being that planet of communication conjunct the sun, people that have Mercury in the sun conjunct need to talk about things. Talking is of value to them. And then in the 7th house, in a sign like Cancer, talking about feelings in your relationship is really important. So she needs to be able to express herself openly in a raw, vulnerable way with her partner. That's a huge value to her. Her rising sign is Sagittarius. So Sag being the sign that was ruled by Jupiter, the seeker, expansion, freedom. Sag people do not want to be told what to do. They want to know things. They want to tell other people about things, and they want freedom. And they want a freedom to explore and travel and learn and expand. They're a little bit rule breakers too. Her moon is in Aquarius, which is also a sign that is very oriented around progressive thinking and wanting to be a rule breaker. Aquarius is the weirdo, the community activist, the Sagittarius is more philanthropic, but Aquarius is the activist. So those two together are very philanthropic. So, and also Cancer being kind of like the sign that rules the mother and is very nurturing. Like she's already just so wired to be who she was. So looking at Sun, Moon, Rising, she's got water, cardinal water, she's got mutable fire, and she's got fixed air. So 3 different modalities. She's a very complex person in that way because she's not just one way. She's not like me and my husband, like I'm fixed, mutable, very go with the flow, but still kind of stubborn. My husband was cardinal, fixed, so more stubborn, but kind of, leader, taking initiative. Very generalized, like that's just with our big 3. But looking at her big 3, she has all of it. Like she's doing the cardinal, fixed, mutable thing in her big 3. So able to go with the flow, but also able to initiate and able to hold it down to some extent, like very powerhouse energy, but not necessarily stable either. Let's look at King Charles' big 3. So we have his sun in Scorpio. So he's got his sun at 27 degrees Scorpio on the cusp of the 5th house. His moon is up at the top in the 10th house at 0 degrees Taurus. So he's got a water sun and an earth moon. And then he's Leo rising. So he's got a fire rising. He is triple fixed. So he doesn't have any, in his big 3, I should say, he doesn't have a lot of go with the flow. Like he's very fixed with who he is. He's stabilizing, he's structured, he's here to hold it down. Let's just look at the big 3 from a compatibility standpoint. They both have water suns. They're not in an exact aspect to each other because they're still too wide to be trining. But again, water likes water. So we can understand why there was an attraction there. They both have fire rising signs. So we can also understand why there was an attraction there. Again, it's a little too wide to be an exact trine, but they're somewhat speaking the same language, having water and fire as those dominant elements, even though they're in different modalities. The moon placement, however, is what we call a square, which we didn't really talk about too much in the compatibility reading with my husband and I, because with our things that you look at in compatibility, we don't have a lot of squares. Squares are considered to be hard energy or tension. And so wherever a square is where we experience challenges. And so for their emotional needs, their energy is in signs that are not compatible with each other. And they're also not in the same polarity. So we were talking about how yang likes yang, yin likes yin. Their moons are not speaking the same language in that way. So Taurus moon, an earth energy, especially in the 10th house, career and public image is everything to King Charles. Who he is in the public eye emotionally is important to him. And looking stable, looking structured, like Taurus wants to be that way. They want to be together, you know, in the material, especially financially, visually, you know, put together, all of that stuff. That's very important to him. Her moon is in the 2nd house, which Taurus rules. So that's an interesting twist on the moon placement, because even though hers is in a sign that squares, it actually still values Taurus themes like material stability, finances, self-worth, having that kind of stuff. But for her, it's more of a value system. And for him, it's more of how he's perceived because it's out in the world. So those are some differences with how that energy gets placed. Also, moon in Aquarius in the 2nd house, the things that you make money doing or the way that your worth is defined is how you're able to really be of service to your community. We could say that's possible for him, considering that he has some energy in the 11th house and he does have the moon in the 10th. Sure, like he might put off that that's important to him. Is it as important to him as it is to her with how he's wired? Probably not in the same way. It's definitely different. So you could see how they ended up together and attracted to each other. But where it started to get kind of fishy is if she's realizing that she actually wants to be philanthropic and wants to change the world. And once she realizes that he's actually just fulfilling a role he was born into, and it's important for him to show that he's holding that role down, but underneath the surface, it might not be as important to him as it is to her to actually do the philanthropic stuff, if that makes sense. So that was probably something that happened in their relationship that was really hard for her to realize, is like, oh, this is more of a show for him than it is for me. Like, this is something that I genuinely want to do. I want to care about the world and change the world, which we see in kind of the way that he was living his life. She got a lot of that judgment too, though. You know, there was a lot of people judging her motives and her intentions as well. With some of that, but that's not what we're looking at. We're just looking at their compatibility. So we're not going to talk about that. So after the moon placement, I don't know if I totally talked about how Aquarius and Taurus square each other, but they square each other. So that's where the hard aspect is. The moons are not in an exact square. So they're not making an exact square, but the signs square each other. So it's tension there. Like what they emotionally need is different. While still sharing similar themes, they still value material stability and structure. The way that they're trying to go about it, totally different. Venus placement. So her Venus is in the 5th house in Taurus. So very compatible for his moon energy. So again, we can kind of see where that ended up making sense, right? You're kind of like, okay, well, if her Venus is speaking the same language as his moon, that actually pads it a little bit. So Venus love language. Venus in Taurus really loves food and loves sharing food with others, and also pleasure in a physical way. Gifts, like material gifts, are really important. So as philanthropic as Princess Diana was, she definitely loved the perks of royalty in that way. And what's interesting is that she had some of those eating disorders. And so that's also really hard for like a Cancer Taurus dominant person. They love food and their love language tends to be through food and cooking. And then to have these pressures to be skinny and more reserved and all of that definitely was not in line with who she was as a person. So that makes sense why there was some conflict there. Her Venus is also not in an exact conjunction with the moon. So it's not together, even though it's in the same sign, and that's definitely helpful, but could be also why they were attracted to each other, but why it wasn't as strong of an attraction over time. Taurus does really value commitment, though, so I can see why his infidelity was definitely hard for her, because the love language of Taurus is to be very committed. and possessive. Scorpio and Taurus can be very possessive. So let's talk about his love language. So he has Venus in Libra and it's in his 4th house. So family is really important to him. So, you know, having kids and being really close with his family is of value, having it in the 4th house. And family is important to her too. She definitely has some stuff there. It's expressed differently being in Taurus, but that's also really compatible for his moon sign. And then Venus in Libra, we talked about Venus in Libra in my chart and how you know, Libra wants a lot of fairness and equality and balance in the relationship. And so if there isn't that balance happening where things feel that way, there can be a lot of contention. If the tastes in the relationship aren't the same, there can be issues there. Libra too, like the air signs tend to be Libra. Yeah, I would say all the air signs tend to be a little bit more fluid sexually or open in relationships. From my experience, I've met a lot of polyamorous Libra dominant people, Gemini dominant people, and Aquarius dominant people. And there's something about that sign that I think tends to be a little bit more like that. You'll notice too, their descendants are both in air signs. So that's also very compatible. But the fact that there was some infidelity on his side, I'm not saying that all air signs or air dominant people, are going to cheat, but obviously I've never cheated on my husband. Like I have Venus in Libra, but I think that there can be people that have, especially Aquarius, I've noticed as a descendant, where they want more openness in relationships. They want more sexual freedom. So there's some signatures for him that might have leaned a little bit more towards that. She has a little bit of it too. So I think if we had lived during a time where we were having more progressive conversations about relationship, because she was also unfaithful. I think she had a partner during her marriage as well as King Charles. They both cheated on each other. There's definitely signatures of that in these charts. And I think if, like I said, if we lived in a more progressive time back then where we could have these conversations more openly and people could be polyamorous or more open with their sexuality, maybe they would have been able to work that stuff out and have, you know, if we didn't have we just think about all of it, like the body stuff going on with her, the body shaming and her eating disorder, and then the sexual stuff going on. Those things are very of value to both of these people, but it was a rigid, you know, environment. And so who knows what would have happened if they were able to express themselves more openly and freely. And if holding up the crown and kind of this traditional mindset wasn't such a thing, they might have been more successful as a couple, because there are a lot of signatures here that show compatibility, but there are also signatures that show a huge need for freedom, especially sexually. He has some of that in his 8th house. The 8th house rules sex, and he's got some signatures here, Lilith and part of fortune, where sex is definitely of value to him. And sex is definitely value to her too. I mean, she's got her whole 8th house super fill here. Her part of fortune's also there. Her Lilith is also there. Uranus, North Node, Mars, and Pluto. I mean, I would say probably sex was really important to her, and connecting physically with Venus here was really important to her, and probably more important to her than it was to him with her. And so there's definitely some things there that make sense why maybe it was harder for them. Obviously I don't know about that. I'm not trying to speak too much about that, but just kind of saying like where, like we know the story went south, kind of some of the reasons why potentially. Also, his Juno is in Aries. And so Juno in Aries is a really independent energy that needs a lot of autonomy and a lot of control. And she is wired to not be controllable. And so if you're with somebody that has a lot of like Scorpio, Taurus, and Aries, like that combination of things can need to feel very in control of their life and what's going on. And so if he had a controlling nature and was trying to do that to somebody that is a rule breaker and has this vast need for freedom, that's going to clash really hard. Scorpio also squares her moon. So even though her Venus is compatible with his moon, his sun and his moon are not compatible with her moon. And so that's also where some of her emotional needs were not getting met. And so that's definitely an issue for them in this chart. her Juno is at 26 degrees Pisces, which is actually really compatible for his sun energy, right? Like water likes water. And so again, we can see how they ended up married, seeing some of these placements. His Aries Juno also makes a compatible aspect to her part of fortune, which is our happy place in Leo. Like, I don't know about their sex life, but I do want to say it was probably really invigorating and hot and steamy in the beginning. And then once the power dynamics of the relationship shifted, the controlling aspects of the relationship, and just the different ways that they valued life, that's where things went south for them. It's really obvious to me why they ended up together and why they broke up from an astrological perspective. They definitely have a lot of things that are really supportive, but they also have a lot of points of contention and deal breakers in a marriage or a relationship where, you know, if she can't be her full authentic self and he wants to control things to the point where his image is perceived in a certain way that she's not abiding by, especially at the magnitude that it was for the crown, that's obviously going to be a huge problem. So, we know that that was a big thing. Would they have had as many problems if maybe they weren't royalty? Like, let's say that they were able to be out of the public eye and navigate a relationship. I don't know, because there are some signatures here that are pretty compatible that I think, again, if we had lived in a more progressive time where they were more open to exploring sexually together. And, you know, I still think that the Taurus Scorpio polarity is a little too controlling, especially with Juno and Aries, for a Cancer with Aquarius moon and Sag rising. Like, I think that she probably needed somebody that was a little bit more open and more free and more free flowing. This person is very domestic and very traditional and wants a lot of passion when it comes to relationship and romance, but when it comes to the everyday, wants more structure and tradition. And for her, she very much wanted more freedom and expansion and exploration. So I don't really know if this relationship would have worked out if, you know, they had had different circumstances, but they definitely had some compatibility that makes sense why they were drawn to each other. His Mars placement too in Sagittarius in the 5th house, this is such a passionate, like Jupiter and Mars here in the 5th house, such a romantic, passionate placement. So I can see, like, he's probably a really romantic person and really good at putting that on in the beginning. And because it's in Sagittarius, that definitely complemented her rising sign. Very passionate, impulsive energy. So I could see too why she maybe had felt that it was one way when in fact underneath it all, he's not really that spontaneous. I think when he's romancing maybe, but you know, when it comes down to the everyday, not as much. And so that might have been something that, you know, came out later that was really difficult for her once they were in their mundane life. And her Juno in Pisces with her Sun and Mercury placement in the 7th house needs so much vulnerability and so much emotional connection. And unfortunately, out of the water signs, Scorpio is the one that's the most reserved. They do have Sun, they both have Sun conjunct Mercury, though. They both really need to talk about things. But the moon in Taurus can sometimes can stonewall. So I think that it kind of also depends on how evolved the person is at the time, right? What they lean into in relation to their chart. So those are some things that, you know, are interesting to see with a couple where they got married, they had kids, they had kind of this one successful chapter and then it ended really poorly. We can see kind of the parts of the chart where, you know, we can't see like, oh yeah, that's going to end poorly, but we can see where the tension is. And so do I think everybody that has some of these incompatibilities ends badly or is going to end? No, not necessarily. But is it obvious to me why there was tension and some hardship as well as attraction? For sure, definitely. I don't think there's anything else that I want to talk about here. I'm starting to fade. So I think that I'm going to call it good, but I hope that that was helpful and informative in terms of how to check out compatibility in the birth chart and kind of how to see what each person needs. I think that this way of doing it, the synastry of learning what somebody needs emotionally and their love language, even just helps you in friendships, because if a friend is, you know, kind of doing something or acting in a specific way, if we know them from this perspective, we might understand more of what they need instead of taking certain things personally when it's not the same as what we would need in that situation. I know for me, up until I understood astrology, there was certain things in my relationship that I would take really personally, you know, like Scorpio moon people, my husband, like they need so much privacy. My dog is having some sleep dreams. He's barking, he's whimpering in his sleep. But yeah, I used to take like sometimes my husband's need for privacy and alone time personally, because my Pisces energy is very the opposite. It's very lovey-dovey. And so even though he has a Venus in Pisces and he gives that to me, he still has a Scorpio moon. That's still like something that he really needs, right? And now I don't take it personally. Same thing, like knowing Mars dominant people, Scorpio, Aries people tend to be a little reactive. I mean, all fire people are reactive. And I've noticed that I get along really well with other people that can be kind of reactive because I can be kind of reactive. And so there's a little bit more room or bandwidth for each other when we understand each other speaking the same language. Sometimes though, if the people are not evolved in themselves and or they lack self-awareness, it doesn't matter how compatible your charts are, because that growth still needs to be done. So a lot of times we'll look at if somebody has had certain astrological transits yet. The Saturn return is a big one, and also some other transits that happen after the Saturn return, like Pluto opposite Uranus, and you know, then there's the midlife crisis transit. I think it's Uranus squaring the sun. But when those transits happen, a lot of shifts can happen in relationships too. I mean, my husband and I got married during his Saturn return. So some people get married, some people divorce. It just depends. Those are also things that you can kind of look at when you're taking a relationship into account. But anyways, that's my little tutorial on how to read astrological compatibility using charts. And feel free to put in the comments any questions that you might have. I'm really tired and did this when I woke up and did not write anything out. I just went on a whim. So there's probably a few things I said that were wrong or misspoke, or words that I used in the wrong way, because that's just how I am. So if you noticed anything that was inaccurate or that you had questions about, feel free to let me know. And also, I wanted to spend more time on Princess Diana and King Charles charts, but I have a chronic illness that flares up when I do something for too long, and I'm flaring up right now. So that's why I don't do readings anymore. All right, talk to you later.